Have you ever imagined what it feels like to live in the beating heart of the world's greatest empire, only to watch it descend into shadows of terror? Rome, the eternal city, once echoed with triumphs and victories, yet under the rule of Caligula, it trembled with whispers of fear. Behind the marble palaces, beneath the golden statues, the laughter of children faded into silence, and the proud steps of Roman citizens slowed into anxious hesitation. What happens when the man who holds absolute power loses the anchor of reason? What happens when he begins to believe not only that he is a ruler, but a god? Caligula's reign was not merely another chapter in the long history of emperors. It was a distortion of Rome's very soul. He turned the empire's grandeur into a theater of cruelty, where loyalty became a curse and celebration became an invitation to humiliation. His madness was not the private delirium of a man. It was a poison that spread into every corner of Roman life. Caligula's path to power was carved in blood long before he wore the purple cloak of an emperor. Born into the infamous Julio-Claudian dynasty, he grew up watching betrayal and death unfold like a daily ritual. His father, Germanicus, a beloved general, died under suspicious circumstances, while his mother and brothers were destroyed in political purges. Young Caligula learned early that in Rome, survival was a cruel art, where smiles concealed daggers and loyalty could be punished more harshly than treason. When the elderly Emperor Tiberius finally passed in 37 AD, the empire turned its hopeful eyes to Caligula. The people saw in him the innocent child once adored by the legions, the young man who might restore dignity and compassion to Rome. In his first months, he seemed to fulfill that dream. He recalled exiles, shared the empire's wealth, and gave dazzling spectacles that rekindled Rome's joy. Citizens cheered, soldiers admired, and senators bowed. But beneath the surface, something darker was waiting. The wounds of his youth, the suspicion that haunted his bloodline, and the intoxicating taste of unchallenged power were gathering like storm clouds. What Rome thought was the dawn of a golden age was, in truth, only the calm before the hurricane. For a fleeting moment, Rome truly believed it had found a savior. Caligula's generosity dazzled the masses. He released prisoners of conscience, ended harsh taxes, and staged games that filled the Colosseum with cheers. Gold flowed into the hands of common citizens, and the Senate, though cautious, applauded his vision of renewal. To the people, this was not just an emperor, it was a miracle. After years of Tiberius' cold suspicion, Caligula seemed warm, approachable, even merciful. But light can be deceptive. Hidden beneath his gestures of kindness was a strange delight in spectacle, an unnerving fascination with blood and violence masked as entertainment. Rome did not yet see it, but in Caligula's eyes, the empire itself was becoming a stage where he alone played both god and executioner. Could it be that his early mercy was never genuine compassion, but merely a calculated lure to win the hearts he would later betray? The people who once shouted his name with joy would soon whisper it in terror. The empire's laughter would turn to silence, and the trust they placed in him would become a weapon used against them. Then came the moment that changed everything. Only 8 months into his reign, Caligula fell into a violent illness. Fever consumed him, and for weeks Rome stood on edge, fearing the emperor's death. When he recovered, Rome celebrated as though the gods themselves had answered their prayers. But the man who emerged from that sickbed was no longer the same. His gaze was sharper, colder. His voice carried an unsettling weight that unsettled even seasoned senators. More disturbingly, he began to speak of himself not as a man, but as a divine being, destined to be worshipped alongside Jupiter and Mars. Statues were raised in his honor, temples rededicated to his image. The line between ruler and god, once carefully balanced, was obliterated in his mind. The illness had done more than ravage his body. It had torn away whatever fragile restraint once remained in his soul. The emperor Rome had adored was gone, replaced by a figure of delusion and wrath. Rome would soon learn that Caligula's newfound divinity came at a price, the sacrifice of its dignity, its safety, and its peace. What once began as royal celebrations quickly twisted into grotesque performances of humiliation and dread. Caligula's feasts became notorious not for their splendor, but for their cruelty. Guests, summoned under the illusion of honor, found themselves trapped in scenes of degradation. Senators who once sat in dignity were forced into shameful acts, Noble women were humiliated before their peers, and even children were not spared the emperor's appetite for spectacle. Wine flowed endlessly, but its sweetness turned bitter in the mouths of those present, for no one knew what Caligula might demand next. At times, he laughed as he toyed with the lives of his guests, deciding on a whim whether someone would leave the feast alive. In the glitter of torches and the echo of lyres, Rome's aristocracy trembled, realizing that banquets no longer celebrated unity but showcased the emperor's sadistic power. It was in these nights that Rome learned, power, when untethered, does not only command respect, it devours humanity itself. Beyond the feasts, Caligula reshaped politics into a theater of terror. The charge of treason became his most convenient weapon, used to silence voices and confiscate the wealth of those he envied. Senators who once debated law now walked into the Senate chamber as if entering a tomb, uncertain if their words or even their silence might condemn them. Taxes grew unbearable, levied not for the empire's welfare, but to feed the emperor's insatiable whims. Palaces and games drained the treasury, while ordinary citizens bore the cost. Every glance at Caligula became a gamble. A misinterpreted look could lead to ruin, while a carefully crafted smile might buy only a few more days of survival. Can you imagine living in a world where even the air you breathed felt dangerous, where the wrong gesture, the wrong word, even the wrong pause in speech could seal your fate? That was Rome under Caligula, a city wrapped not in marble and triumph, but in dread. Rome, forged by conquest and hardened in true battle, found itself mocked by the man who claimed to lead its armies. Caligula, dressed in gleaming armor, marched his legions not to confront an enemy, but to stage hollow victories. On the shores of Gaul, he ordered his soldiers to gather seashells as spoils of war, declaring triumph over Neptune, the god of the sea. The spectacle left hardened warriors in stunned silence. Should they laugh at the absurdity or tremble at the madness? Campaigns once meant to expand Rome's power were reduced to farcical rituals, empty parades that insulted the blood of those who had died in true battles. Officers humiliated, veterans shamed, entire cohorts forced to play roles in the emperor's delusion. And yet no man dared question him. To doubt the divine emperor was to invite death. Rome, once feared for its disciplined legions, became the stage for a grotesque parody of war. If the battlefield was absurd, the palace was a nightmare. Within its gilded halls, the atmosphere thickened with dread. Courtiers studied the emperor's face the way sailors study storm clouds. Every flicker of expression, every shift in tone, a sign that could mean life or death. A misplaced compliment could draw a smile one day and a blade the next. Whispers died in throats, and laughter was silenced before it could escape lips. The walls themselves seemed to listen, as informants thrived in the fear that consumed the court. Some were tortured publicly, their agony a warning. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the palace shadows, their names erased as though they had never lived. The palace, once the heart of Rome's power, became a labyrinth of terror where survival meant silence and obedience. For those who served closest to Caligula, loyalty was not a virtue, but a curse, chaining them to the whims of a ruler who recognized no limits but his own desire. Terror has a way of binding men together, and in the suffocating silence of Caligula's court, whispers of rebellion began to grow. Cassius Caria, once mocked and humiliated by the emperor, became the reluctant architect of a desperate plan. Alongside members of the Praetorian Guard, those sworn to protect Caligula, they plotted his end. Each man knew the risk. If discovered, their families would perish, their names cursed. But living under Caligula had become worse than death itself. On a cold January day in 41 AD, fate arrived. As the emperor walked through a dimly lit corridor beneath the palace, soldiers closed in. Blades flashed, and the god-emperor's illusions shattered with his final screams. The man who had styled himself as immortal fell to the same steel he once wielded against others. Isn't it ironic that those tasked with shielding his life became the very instruments of his destruction? Rome exhaled when Caligula's reign ended, but the relief was mingled with scars that would never fully heal. The Senate decreed a damnatio memoria, an erasure of his name from inscriptions, statues, and public memory. Yet no decree could erase the terror etched into the minds of those who lived through his rule. Caligula became less a man than a warning, a symbol of how quickly unchecked power corrodes the pillars of civilization. His death brought Claudius to the throne, a man thought weak but destined to restore some balance. Still, the shadow of Caligula lingered. His story reminds us that even the mightiest empires can falter when their leaders lose all restraint. Power without boundaries is not strength, it is decay. And so, centuries later, we still ask ourselves, if Rome, the greatest empire of its age, could be reduced to trembling under the madness of one man, how safe are we in our own time? Do we truly believe that humanity has outgrown the dangers of absolute power? Or are we, like Rome, always one heartbeat away from the rise of another Caligula?